They called them jokes. Cannon fodder. The forgotten soldiers of a forgotten dominion. When Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General George Patton sat in their command tents, plotting the liberation of Europe, they shared one rare moment of agreement. The Canadians? Those provincial farm boys and lumberjacks pretending to be soldiers? They were punchlines in a war that demanded legends. Montgomery, with his crisp British accent and aristocratic disdain, would dismiss them with a wave of his hand. Patton, never one to mince words, called them worse. These two titans of military strategy, men who could barely stand to be in the same room together, found common ground in their contempt for the forces from the Great White North. And yet, when the chips were down, when the entire Allied war effort hung by a thread, when Antwerp needed to be taken and the port needed to be opened, guess who they called? The jokes. The laughingstocks. The Canadians. This is the story of how the most underestimated, most disrespected, most overlooked fighting force in World War II proved everyone wrong. This is about how young men, dismissed as amateurs and rustics, accomplished what the military mastermind said was impossible. This is about blood, sacrifice, and a quiet determination that would reshape the course of history. And if you think you know this story, I promise you, you don't know half of it. Before we dive deep into one of the most extraordinary military campaigns you've never heard about, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the untold stories, the forgotten heroes, the moments that changed everything but somehow got left out of the history books. And drop a comment below telling me what you think. Did you know about the Canadian role in liberating Europe? Have you heard these names before? Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Now let's get into it. September 1944. The Allied forces are racing across Europe. Paris has been liberated. The newsreels show jubilant crowds, soldiers kissing French girls, champagne flowing in the streets. The war, everyone believes, will be over by Christmas. Hitler's fortress Europe is crumbling. The Wehrmacht is in retreat. Victory seems inevitable, obvious, just a matter of time. But behind the celebration, behind the propaganda and the optimistic headlines, there's a problem. A massive, catastrophic problem that threatens to derail the entire war effort. The Allies are running out of supplies. Every tank needs fuel. Every soldier needs ammunition. Every hospital needs medicine. Every forward position needs food, water, equipment. And all of it, every single ton of material, has to come through ports. The English Channel ports are either destroyed by retreating Germans or too small to handle the volume. The artificial mulberry harbors on the Normandy beaches are innovative but insufficient. The logistics officers are pulling their hair out. The supply lines are stretched to the breaking point, and the advance is grinding to a halt not because of German resistance, but because the trucks are running on empty. The solution? Antwerp. The port of Antwerp, in Belgium, is one of the largest and most sophisticated port facilities in Europe. It can handle the volume. It has the infrastructure. It's closer to the front lines. If the Allies can capture Antwerp and get it operational, they can sustain their advance, maintain momentum, and possibly end the war before the year is out. It's the key to everything. And in early September, British forces roll into Antwerp and capture the city. The port facilities are largely intact. The Germans retreated without destroying them. It looks like a miracle. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Because Antwerp sits at the end of a 60-mile estuary called the Scheldt. The Scheldt estuary is a maze of channels, islands, flooded polders, and fortified positions. And the Germans still control both sides of it. Every ship trying to reach Antwerp has to run a gauntlet of German artillery, German observation posts, German fortifications. The port is useless. It's like having the keys to a Ferrari but the car is locked in a garage surrounded by armed guards. You own it but you can't use it. Montgomery, now promoted to Field Marshal and commanding the 21st Army Group, makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his career. He decides the Scheldt can wait. His eyes are on a different prize. Operation Market Garden, the audacious plan to drop paratroopers behind German lines, capture a series of bridges, and punch through into Germany itself. Just bold. It's dramatic. It's the kind of operation that wins wars and makes legends. Montgomery is convinced it will work. He commits his best forces, his attention, his resources to Market Garden. And he leaves the Scheldt to the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Army, under the command of General Harry Crerar, is tasked with clearing the estuary. It's presented as a mopping-up operation, a straightforward task of clearing out some demoralized German remnants. Nothing glamorous, nothing that will make the newsreels, but it needs to be done. The Canadians, Montgomery implies, should be perfect for it. After all, how hard could it be? General Harry Crerar is a career officer, methodical and professional. His subordinate, Lieutenant General Guy Simons, is younger, more aggressive, a tactical innovator who has already proven himself in Normandy. Together, they look at the Scheldt and they understand immediately what Montgomery either doesn't see or doesn't want to acknowledge. This isn't a mopping-up operation. This is going to be hell. The Scheldt estuary is a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The Germans have had years to prepare these defenses. The coastline is fortified with concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests. The islands, Walcheren and South Beveland, are studded with fortifications. The lowlands are flooded, deliberately inundated by the Germans to create impassable marshes. The few roads that exist are narrow causeways, perfect kill zones where a single machine gun can hold up an entire battalion. And the Germans defending this nightmare? They're not demoralized stragglers. They're the 64th Infantry Division, the 70th Infantry Division, units that have been fighting for years, veterans who know every inch of this terrain. And the Canadians? They've been fighting continuously since D-Day. They've slugged through Normandy, liberated towns and villages across France and Belgium. They're exhausted. Their divisions are under strength. They've taken casualties that haven't been fully replaced. And now they're being asked to assault fortifications that make Normandy look easy. But there's no choice. Without Antwerp, the war effort stalls. Without the Canadians clearing the Scheldt, Antwerp stays closed. So they prepare to do the impossible. Let me paint you a picture of what they're facing. Imagine you're a 20-year-old kid from Saskatchewan or Ontario or British Columbia. Maybe 6 months ago you were working on a farm or in a factory. Now you're standing on a muddy road in Belgium, and in front of you is a flooded polder. The water is cold, chest-deep in places, and you can't see the bottom. You know there are mines in that water. You know there are machine guns zeroed in on the causeways. You know that the moment you move forward, all hell is going to break loose. And you're exhausted, cold, wet, and scared. But your orders are clear. Take that position. Clear that bunker. Secure that village. So you check your rifle, you look at the guys next to you, guys who have become closer than brothers, and you move forward. The Battle of the Scheldt officially begins on October 2, 1944. The first phase is the Battle of the Breskens Pocket, a brutal fight to clear the southern shore of the estuary. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, along with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, launches amphibious assaults across flooded terrain. They're landing on hostile shores under fire, wading through water, dragging equipment and weapons, while German machine guns cut through their ranks. It's like a nightmare version of D-Day, but without the air support, without the naval bombardment, without the glory. The fighting is intimate and savage. Bunkers have to be taken one at a time. Each German position is a miniature fortress. The Canadians use flamethrowers, explosives, grenades, whatever works. They call in artillery, but the muddy ground absorbs much of the impact. Tank support is limited because the terrain is too soft, too flooded. This is infantry work, the hardest, deadliest kind of combat. Small units advancing across open ground, taking fire, hitting the dirt, getting up, moving forward again. Private George Hickson, a rifleman from Nova Scotia, later wrote in his diary about clearing a German bunker near the town of Breskens. He and 5 other soldiers approached through a drainage ditch, crawling on their bellies through freezing water. They could hear the German machine gun firing in bursts, pinning down their platoon. When they got close enough, Hickson's sergeant threw a grenade through the bunker's firing slit. The explosion was muffled by the concrete, but the firing stopped. They rushed the entrance. 3 Germans stumbled out, hands up, faces black with powder burns. One was barely 16 years old. Hickson wrote that the kid was crying, calling for his mother. They took him prisoner and moved on to the next position. Multiply that scene by hundreds. By thousands. Because that's what the Battle of the Scheldt was. Not grand tank battles or sweeping maneuvers. Just small groups of men, cold and scared and determined, taking one position after another, day after day, week after week. The casualties mount. The 3rd Canadian Division takes heavy losses. Companies that started with 100 men are down to 50, then 30. The medics work around the clock. The Graves registration units can't keep up. And back at headquarters? Montgomery is focused on Market Garden. The operation launches on September 17th, and it's a disaster. The paratroopers at Arnhem are cut off and destroyed. The bridge too far remains in German hands. Thousands of Allied soldiers are killed or captured. And Market Garden, the bold operation that was supposed to end the war, becomes one of the greatest Allied failures of World War II. Meanwhile, in the mud and blood of the Scheldt, the Canadians keep fighting. No headlines. No glory. Just the grim work of winning the war. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. As Market Garden is falling apart, the supply situation becomes critical. Patton's Third Army is literally out of fuel. American divisions are rationing ammunition. The logistics officers are screaming for Antwerp to be opened. And suddenly the operation that Montgomery dismissed as a mopping-up job becomes the most important campaign on the Western Front. The Canadian battle that nobody was paying attention to is now the key to everything. On October 6, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division launches an assault on South Beveland, the peninsula connecting to Walcheren Island. This is a different kind of hell. The Germans have blown the dikes, flooding the land. The only approach is along a narrow causeway, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. And this causeway is covered by German artillery, mortars, and machine guns. Every meter is contested. The Canadians have to fight through fortified villages, through flooded fields, through constant artillery bombardment. The Calgary Highlanders lead the assault on the causeway. They advance under cover of darkness, but the Germans have the area illuminated with flares. The 1st Company makes it halfway across before a murderous crossfire erupts. Men fall. The survivors push forward. They reach a German position, overwhelm it in hand-to-hand combat, and hold on while the next wave comes up. By dawn they've secured a foothold but at a terrible cost. The battalion takes over 200 casualties in 24 hours. But they don't stop. Can't stop. Because every day Antwerp remains closed, soldiers on the entire Western Front go without supplies. Every day the Scheldt remains in German hands, the war drags on. The Canadians understand the stakes. They've always understood. While Montgomery and Patton were measuring themselves against each other, trying to be the first into Germany, the first to Berlin, the Canadians were doing what needed to be done. Let me tell you about Walcheren Island. This is the final, most daunting obstacle. Walcheren sits at the mouth of the Scheldt, and it's the most heavily fortified position in the entire estuary. Concrete bunkers. Artillery batteries with fields of fire covering every approach. Thousands of German defenders who know this is their last stand. The Allies have tried air raids. The RAF bombs the dikes, flooding much of the island, but the German positions on the high ground remain intact. A direct assault looks suicidal. The plan calls for multiple simultaneous attacks. British commandos will assault from the sea. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division will cross from South Beveland. It's complicated, risky, and depends on precise coordination. The assault begins on November 1, 1944. The commandos land under heavy fire. The Canadians advance across the flooded lowlands. And once again it's brutal, close-quarters combat. Village by village. Bunker by bunker. The Germans fight desperately because they know what's at stake. If Walcheren falls, Antwerp opens. If Antwerp opens, Germany's defeat becomes inevitable. The fighting in Walcheren reaches a level of intensity that shocks even veteran soldiers. The Royal Regiment of Canada fights a 3-day battle for the town of Flushing. They go house to house, room to room. Snipers on both sides pick off anyone who shows themselves. Artillery turns entire blocks into rubble. The civilians who haven't evacuated are trapped in cellars, praying for it to end. One Canadian lieutenant later described entering a building and finding a German soldier and a Canadian soldier, both dead, their hands still gripped around each other's throats. They'd killed each other in hand-to-hand combat, and neither had let go even in death. But slowly, inexorably the Canadians gain ground. The commandos link up with the Canadian units. The German defenses begin to crack. Isolated strongpoints hold out, forcing the Canadians to reduce them one by one. The flamethrowers come out again. The engineers use demolition charges to crack open bunkers. It's methodical, brutal work. By November 8, Walcheren is secure. The Battle of the Scheldt is over. The cost? The 1st Canadian Army suffered over 6,000 casualties. Dead, wounded, missing. Entire battalions decimated. Young men who left farms and small towns in Canada, who crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, who never came home. Their names are carved on memorials in Belgium and the Netherlands, places most people have never heard of. Breskens, Wensdrecht, Kapellschwier. These names don't resonate like Normandy or the Bulge, but they should. Because here's what happened next. The Royal Navy sweeps the Scheldt for mines. It takes 2 more weeks, but on November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy sails up the Scheldt and docks at Antwerp. The port is open. Within weeks, Antwerp is handling more cargo than all other Allied ports combined. The supply crisis is over. Patton's tanks get their fuel. Montgomery's divisions get their ammunition. The advance into Germany resumes. And 6 months later, the war in Europe is won. None of it would have been possible without Antwerp. And Antwerp wouldn't have been possible without the Canadians clearing the Scheldt. The operation that Montgomery treated as an afterthought, the battle he left to the jokes and the amateurs, turned out to be the decisive campaign of late 1944. Military historians now recognize the Battle of the Scheldt as one of the most important operations of the war. But at the time, the Canadians received barely a mention in the press. No newsreels. No ticker tape parades. Just orders to move on to the next objective. And Montgomery? He never apologized. Never acknowledged his mistake. In his memoirs he glosses over the Scheldt, downplays the Canadian contribution, and focuses on Market Garden as if it had been a near success rather than a costly failure. Patton, for his part, complained bitterly about fuel shortages in his diary, never once acknowledging who solved that problem for him. The two great generals, the legends, the heroes of World War II, couldn't bring themselves to admit that the men they dismissed as jokes had saved their reputations and possibly the entire campaign. But the Dutch remember. In the Netherlands, Canadian soldiers are treated as liberators and heroes to this day. Every year, Dutch schoolchildren learn about the Canadian sacrifice. They tend Canadian war graves. They send tulips to Canada every spring, a tradition that has continued for 80 years. The Dutch government and people never forgot who freed them, who fought through their flooded polders and shattered towns, who died on their soil to give them their freedom back. There's a cemetery in the Netherlands called the Canadian War Cemetery Bergen op Zoom. It's beautifully maintained, surrounded by quiet Dutch countryside. Row after row of white headstones, each marking a Canadian soldier who fell in the Battle of the Scheldt. The youngest was 19. The oldest was 43. They came from every province, every background. Farmers, factory workers, students, miners. United by a sense of duty, by a belief that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for. Walk through that cemetery and read the names. Private John Mackenzie from Cape Breton. Corporal Robert Fontaine from Quebec. Lieutenant David Wong from Vancouver. Sergeant James Blackfoot from Alberta. Canada sent her sons, all of them, and they answered the call. They fought not for glory or recognition, but because it needed to be done. And when the so-called experts dismissed them, when the military geniuses called them inadequate, they proved everyone wrong in the most definitive way possible. Let me bring this home for you. The story of the Canadians at Scheldt is about more than military history. It's about being underestimated and proving your worth not with words, but with action. It's about doing the hard, unglamorous work while others chase glory. It's about sacrifice without recognition, courage without fanfare. These lessons resonate far beyond the battlefield. How many times in life are you told you're not good enough? That you don't have what it takes? That you should leave the important work to someone else? The Canadians faced that dismissal from the highest levels of Allied command, and they responded by accomplishing what those same commanders said was impossible. Montgomery and Patton were brilliant in many ways. Their contributions to Allied victory are undeniable. But they were wrong about the Canadians. Catastrophically wrong. And their inability to admit it, their refusal to give credit where credit was due, diminishes them. True leadership acknowledges excellence wherever it's found. True greatness doesn't need to belittle others to elevate itself. The Canadians didn't need Montgomery's approval or Patton's respect to do what needed to be done. They had something more important. They had each other and they had a mission. Think about the courage it takes to advance across a flooded field under machine gun fire. To wade through chest-deep water, knowing the next step might trigger a mine. To climb out of that water and assault a fortified bunker while bullets are snapping past your head. To watch your friends fall and keep going anyway. That's not the courage of ignorance or fanaticism. That's the courage of men who understand exactly what they're facing and choose to face it anyway. That's the courage that wins wars. And here's something else that often gets overlooked. The Battle of the Scheldt wasn't just Canadian infantry. It was the Royal Canadian Artillery providing the fire support. The Royal Canadian Engineers clearing the mines and repairing the roads. The Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps working in field hospitals under artillery fire. The Royal Canadian Air Force flying reconnaissance missions over German positions. It was a total national effort. Every element of the Canadian military contributed. They worked together with a level of coordination and professionalism that impressed even their critics. The Scheldt also demonstrated the Canadian talent for innovation under pressure. When conventional tactics didn't work, they adapted. They used amphibious vehicles and flooded terrain. They developed new techniques for clearing bunkers. They coordinated combined arms operations in conditions that military textbooks said were impossible. Guy Simons, the Canadian Corps commander, proved himself to be one of the finest tactical minds of the war. His planning for the Scheldt was meticulous, his execution flexible and responsive to changing conditions. He deserves to be remembered alongside the famous generals, but outside of Canada, few people have heard his name. There's a broader pattern here worth examining. Throughout history, the contributions of smaller nations often get overshadowed by the major powers. Britain and America dominate the narrative of World War II in the English-speaking world. The Soviet Union's massive sacrifice is acknowledged, at least by historians. But the Commonwealth nations? Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India? Their stories get reduced to footnotes. It's not deliberate malice. It's just the way historical narratives work. The big players get the spotlight and everyone else fades into the background. But those footnotes contain extraordinary stories. The Canadian advance from Normandy to the Netherlands is one of the great military campaigns of the war. They fought at D-Day. They liberated Caen. They closed the Falaise Gap. They swept across Belgium and the Netherlands. They crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany. At every stage they faced elite German units and prevailed. By the end of the war, the Canadian Army was one of the most experienced and effective fighting forces on the Western Front. But how many people know that? Here's where I want you to engage. If you didn't know about the Battle of the Scheldt before watching this, drop a comment and tell me. If you're Canadian and you learned about this in school, let me know. If you're Dutch or Belgian and you have family stories about the liberation, I want to hear them. These stories matter. These sacrifices matter. And the only way they stay alive is if we keep talking about them, keep sharing them, keep refusing to let them fade into obscurity. So comment, share this video, make sure other people see it. History belongs to all of us and we have a responsibility to remember all of it, not just the parts that made it into Hollywood movies. Let's talk about one more aspect of this story. The relationship between the Canadians and the Dutch civilians. As the Canadians fought through the Netherlands in late 1944 and early 1945, they weren't just liberators in an abstract sense. They were bringing food to starving people. The Germans had imposed brutal reprisals on the Dutch population. Food supplies were cut off. The winter of 1944 to 1945, known in the Netherlands as the Hunger Winter, killed over 20,000 Dutch civilians. Canadian soldiers shared their rations with Dutch families. They gave chocolate to children who'd forgotten what sweets tasted like. They brought medicine to hospitals. They restored hope to a population that had endured 4 years of occupation. There are countless stories of Canadian soldiers forming bonds with Dutch families. Soldiers who were billeted in Dutch homes and treated like sons. Romances that blossomed and led to marriages. Dutch children who were adopted by Canadian families after the war. These personal connections are why the Dutch gratitude is so enduring. It's not abstract national appreciation. It's deeply personal, passed down through generations. Dutch grandparents tell their grandchildren about the Canadians who gave them food when they were starving, who freed their village, who made it possible for them to have a future. One story stands out. In the town of Apeldoorn, a Canadian medical officer named Captain John Mahoney set up a field hospital and a damaged school. The fighting had moved on, but there were still casualties, both military and civilian. Mahoney worked for 72 hours straight, performing surgeries, treating wounded soldiers and Dutch civilians alike. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, the Dutch nurses took over, having learned techniques from watching him. After the war, Mahoney returned to Canada and rarely spoke about his service. But in Apeldoorn they named a street after him. Every year on Liberation Day someone places flowers at the street sign. Captain Mahoney died in 1978, but the people of Apeldoorn still remember. That's the other side of war. Amid the violence and destruction there's humanity. There's compassion. There's connection. The Canadian soldiers weren't machines or heroes from mythology. They were young men far from home, scared and tired, but determined to do the right thing. And when they encountered civilians who were suffering, they helped. It wasn't in their orders. It wasn't part of the mission. They did it because it was the human thing to do. Now, I want to address something that might be on your mind. Why does this story matter today? Why should you care about a battle that happened 80 years ago? Because the lessons are timeless. The Battle of the Scheldt teaches us about perseverance in the face of dismissal. It teaches us about the importance of doing unglamorous, necessary work. It teaches us that recognition and validation are nice, but they're not why we do important things. We do them because they need to be done. In a world that's increasingly focused on image and brand and social media presence, there's something powerful about people who do vital work without seeking applause. The Canadians at Scheldt didn't have a publicity campaign. They weren't thinking about how this would play in the papers. They were focused on the mission. And because they stayed focused, because they did the work regardless of recognition, they achieved something extraordinary. That's a lesson that applies to every field, every endeavor. Do the work. Do it well. Do it for its own sake. The rest will take care of itself. There's also a lesson here about leadership and respect. Montgomery and Patton failed their own troops and their allies through their dismissive attitudes. Good leaders recognize and value the contributions of everyone on the team. They don't play favorites based on nationality or social class. They assess competence honestly and give credit where it's due. The fact that Montgomery and Patton couldn't do that reveals a flaw in their leadership, regardless of their tactical brilliance. And conversely, the Canadian commanders, Crerar, Simons, and the officers and NCOs at every level, demonstrated leadership through their actions, their planning, and their care for their men. Let me share one final story that encapsulates everything about the Canadian experience at Scheldt. In November 1944, after Walcheren had been secured but while the port was still being cleared of mines, a young Canadian private named Leo Major was on patrol near the town of Zwolle. Major was a legendary figure, already awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for capturing a German half-track and its crew single-handedly in Normandy. He wore an eye patch after losing an eye to a phosphorus grenade, but he refused evacuation and stayed with his unit. On the night of April 13, 1945, as the war was winding down, Major and his corporal were tasked with reconnaissance in Zwolle. The town was held by German forces, and the Canadian command wanted information before launching an assault. Major had a different idea. He and his corporal entered the town in darkness, and Major decided they were going to liberate it themselves. Just the two of them. His corporal was killed early in the action, but Major continued alone. He ran through the streets firing his machine gun, throwing grenades, making as much noise as possible. The Germans, convinced they were under attack by a much larger force, began to retreat. Major captured German officers and forced them to order their troops to withdraw. By morning, Zwolle was liberated, and Major had done it virtually single-handedly. He refused the Distinguished Conduct Medal a second time because Montgomery would have presented it, and Major disliked Montgomery for the casualties his tactics had caused. Leo Major's story is almost unbelievable, but it's documented and verified. He represents the Canadian spirit at its finest, resourceful, courageous, and utterly unpretentious. He didn't liberate Zwolle for glory. He did it because it meant one less battle, fewer casualties among his friends. After the war, he went home to Quebec, worked as a pipe fitter, and rarely discussed his service. When he died in 2008, the Dutch government sent representatives to his funeral. The mayor of Zwolle attended. Because they remembered. They honored the man who Montgomery and Patton would have dismissed as a joke. So here we are at the end of this story, and I hope you're feeling what I felt when I first learned about the Battle of the Scheldt. Anger at the injustice of these men being dismissed and forgotten. Pride in their accomplishments. Sadness for the price they paid. And determination to make sure their story gets told. Because that's how we honor them now. We can't give them back their youth or their lives. We can't undo their suffering. But we can remember. We can tell their stories. We can make sure that when someone says Canadians were jokes, we correct them. We tell them about Scheldt. About Normandy. About the liberation of the Netherlands. About Leo Major and Captain Mahoney and Private George Hickson and the thousands of others whose names we'll never know but whose courage changed the world. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for caring enough to listen to this story. Now I'm asking you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We're building a community of people who care about forgotten history, untold stories, the voices that got drowned out by the official narratives. Second, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this content matters, that people want to see it, that these stories deserve to be amplified. And third, comment. Tell me what you thought. Tell me what you learned. Share your own family stories if you have connections to these events. The comment section is where community happens, where history becomes a conversation instead of a lecture. Montgomery and Patton agreed on one thing. They were wrong. The Canadians weren't jokes. They were heroes. They were liberators. They were the men who did what needed to be done when everyone else was looking the other way. They were the soldiers who took Antwerp and opened the port and saved the Allied war effort. And 80 years later, in cemeteries across the Netherlands and Belgium, their headstones stand in silent testimony to courage, sacrifice, and the quiet determination of men who never needed anyone's approval to do the right thing. The next time you hear someone dismissed or underestimated, remember the Canadians at Scheldt. Remember that the experts can be wrong. Remember that true strength doesn't always announce itself. And remember that history, real history, is made by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not because they want fame or recognition, but because someone has to, and they're the ones who stepped up. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And never forget, the jokes took Antwerp. The jokes won the war. And the jokes deserve their place in history.